from Nunavut, and we say asuyutit for hello. This is how you say hello in Mi'kmaq. Pue. Ganche. Ganche.
Southern Shoshone.
How you say hello in our language is Sagoli, or Sagoli Swagweke for everyone.
How you say hello in Blackfoot is Ukki. We are from Cochiti Pueblo. Goetze Hopa.
Kolamalsi. Yep, that's how you say hello. Dante. Yeah, Dante.
This is how you say hello in Ojibwe, Ani. This is how we say hello in Tansi.
Saigon.
Scano. Buju.
Inu, and to say hello is Etili Hai.
And how do you spell it?
I have no sweet clue.
Hey, I'm Jackie McKay with CBC Indigenous in Vancouver. I'm really excited to share my playlist with you. First up, my short documentary on the Sinixt in the Columbia River Treaty. This story took me months to put together. It started as a totally different story, but as I went deeper into the rabbit hole, I discovered that a giant international treaty between Canada and the US was tied up in a declaration of extinction of a group of people. So I want to share with you a playlist about land. Who claims it, who gets a say on what happens to it, and how it's changing and the impact that is having on the people who live on it. I hope you enjoy.
These kinds of things are important for your future and your children's future, your grandchildren's future.
Shelley Boyd has spent most of her life advocating for the Sinixt and is the language and culture teacher in Inchulum. Almost all the kids who go here are Sinixt. Even though they live only an hour away from the Canadian border, most of them have never been on their traditional territory. Boyd says Inchulum is located in one of the poorest counties in Washington, and crossing the border isn't always so simple.
They found gold in Republic, and then we got pushed. Now we're down here. So we're not on our traditional territory anymore.
For a lot of these students, this is the first time they're hearing about the Columbia River Treaty, and they don't understand why they're being left out.
So I think we shouldn't be recognized as just Americans if we come from Canadian land as well.
We should also get kind of a big say in it too, because it was ours to begin with.
The Columbia River Treaty is being renegotiated right now. The government of BC says it can't bring the Sinixt to the negotiating table because the Colville Confederated Tribes represents the Sinixt and are already engaged with U.S. negotiators. BC says bringing the Sinixt in could jeopardize Canada's negotiating position and place the Sinixt in a conflict of interest.
It doesn't make any sense. The United States would never do anything with land in Canada, and that's where our territory is. So how would the United States represent us in Canada?
As long as our cultural memory goes, the headwaters of the Columbia, all the way down to Kettle Falls, that's where our home is. And so, that's how important it is. I don't think we can distinguish Sinixt separate from the Columbia River.
Stevie Seymour is Sinixt, and she is dedicated to revitalizing her culture. She says now is the time for Canada to right historic wrongs against the Sinixt, while the Columbia River Treaty is being renegotiated.
Canada talks about truth and reconciliation while sweeping us under the rug. And it's over and over again.
80% of the Sinixt traditional territory is in Canada, covering the main stem of the Columbia River. In the 1880s, when the Indian agent first came through Sinixt land, he missed them, which meant, in part, no reserve was set up. As a result, Sinixt were displaced across their territory, and hundreds moved into the U.S. Oates Got their reserve was established on the western shore of Arrow Lakes in 1902. Only 26 people moved there, and it's now underwater. The last registered person on the reserve, Annie Joseph, died in 1953. 3 years later, Canada and the U.S. started formal discussions that would become the Columbia River Treaty. Canada was already clearing land in the interior of BC to flood it. The treaty's purpose was for year-round electricity and flood control, with a series of dams and reservoirs. That same year, Canada declared the Sinixt extinct. Many historians and Sinixt say this isn't a coincidence.
We have been removed from the landscape of Canada. That is a complete genocide.
The treaty was signed in 1961 and ratified 3 years later.
The treaty we proclaim will lay a new foundation of prosperity for Canadians and Americans for your West and for ours.
The U.S. paid Canada just over $64 million to control floods for 60 years. But come September 2024, that agreement expires, leaving either side open to make changes to the treaty or even terminate it. For the last 10 years, talks have been underway about these renegotiations, and Canada has been consulting with the Ktunaxa, Secwepemc, and Syilx Okanagan nations, but not the Sinixt.
Nothing's happening. Instead, they're working to make sure that we're not included, that in 2024 this is signed without one Sinixt voice saying anything.
The Sinixt moved near Kettle Falls, Washington, but when gold was found there, they were forced to move again to Inshalum, nowhere near their traditional territory.
Our home isn't a country. Our home is the Columbia River.
In 2021, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled the Sinixt is an Aboriginal people of Canada and were, in fact, not extinct. It meant that the Sinixt is entitled to exercise Section 35 of the Constitution. Section 35 recognizes and affirms the rights of Indigenous peoples, which includes the duty to consult.
They're acting like we don't exist, but the courts have said we do. The courts have confirmed we're Aboriginal people of Canada. What does that mean?
It's hard to know how much the Colville tribes are getting in the U.S. The State Department confirmed the tribe members signed non-disclosure agreements to ensure confidentiality of the negotiations. The chairman of the Colville Confederated Tribes confirmed with CBC that Canada has not reached out to them about the negotiations. The BC government acknowledges the Columbia River Treaty caused harm to First Nations. Its website talks about the damage flooding caused to First Nations, land, fish, habitat, and artifacts, but doesn't say which First Nations it's referring to.
The surest sign I have of how significant this is that the Canadian government and the BC government have relentlessly refused to allow the Sinixt to be at the negotiating table. And I think that's the first clue that we're sitting on a really powerful moment here.
Eileen Delahanty Perks has written books on the Columbia River Treaty and the Sinixt. She has reviewed documents that prove the BC government knowingly flooded land with Sinixt graves, and that 90% of archaeological sites in the Arrow Lakes were destroyed. Perks says there was a huge rush to build these dams because the U.S. offered Canada bonuses if they completed early.
It was just greed in the end that caused them to look away and allow these cultural sites to be flooded without preservation.
The river is essentially liquid gold. The treaty between the U.S. and Canada is there to ensure that every drop of water is being managed. In hydropower alone, the Columbia generates billions of dollars. It provides nearly 50% of BC's power and 40% of all U.S. hydroelectric power.
There's something very powerful going on when you take an extremely rich hydropower system worth billions of dollars and you expose a truth about the lack of ethics and the lack of truth in that process.
One other aspect in the renegotiations is the salmon. The fish have huge cultural significance to First Nations and tribes all along the river. Large dams in the U.S. have blocked salmon from accessing 40% of their natural habitat. Restoring the salmon to the Upper Columbia and repairing the ecosystem is a priority for DR Michelle.
Let's start to do those things we need to do to correct some of those historic wrongs and make this a better place for all of us, those future generations, for the benefit of all.
Recently, the Biden administration made a commitment, more than $200 million over 20 years to the Upper Columbia tribes to reintroduce salmon to the river. Michelle says his grandparents were the last people in his family to see salmon at Kettle Falls. If done right, future generations will see salmon return to the river.
We can have hydro production, we can have flood risk management, we can have our fish back. We can afford to do all of that. It doesn't have to be a fight over.
Unless Canada opens the door, and because of the Digital decision, the Sinixt only recourse may be legal action.
They have all of the same legal tools available to kind of force the government to the table that a group situated in Canada would. And that's the key takeaway. There's no higher legal bar for a group in the United States than there is in Canada.
But when the duty to consult applies in an international treaty is tricky. According to Brown, the courts haven't resolved if the government has a duty to consult during the negotiating phase. He says that may be purely a political matter and not for the courts to decide.
Even if it's legally unclear whether or not the government has to do it, there's nothing stopping the government from consulting, from engaging nations in the negotiation table if they think it's a good idea to do.
When the new treaty is implemented into Canadian law, this would likely be the phase where the duty to consult is triggered. For Seymour, though, she says the Sinixt should be consulted now.
Ideally, what would happen is Canada and the other tribes would say, hey, you know what, you have been blocked. You have been wronged here. And welcome to the table.
Negotiations will end in a matter of months. Who is to benefit and how the power of the Columbia will be harnessed for the next several decades is still to be decided. Jackie McKay for CBC Indigenous in Washington State.
On the banks of the South Saskatchewan River, a National Historic Site has for 100 years told the story of Batoche. It's here that Louis Riel and other Métis leaders made their last stand against armed federal forces. But the land was still owned by the federal government, the historic site run by Parks Canada, until that is last year.
I want to bring my kids and grandkids and show them, that this is all actually ours.
In July 2022, the federal and provincial governments transferred 690 hectares of land from the western part of Batoche back to the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan. Valerie Gaudette comes here to feel connected to her ancestors. She's struck by its peace and beauty.
It does make me emotional, but a good way, a good, happy way.
I feel, especially in this right here, as we're looking out into the river and we're looking at the Westlands, I feel like it's such a spiritual place, and there's something that hits your heart. I feel very proud.
Vice President Michelle Leclerc from the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan says Métis people once lived along this river with a strong sense of community.
Around 1885, in this region, there was about 1,500 Métis people. And then the Battle of Batoche, of course, happened. And after the Battle of Batoche, Riel was hung, and 7 First Nations chiefs were hung in North Battleford. There was a lot of scare tactics happening, and I think Métis families dispersed from here.
Every year, the Back to Batoche Festival takes place, but now the Métis Nation can do much more. It's building a lodge for youth to teach them about the land, their culture, and their language.
I think it's 0.5% of our youth speak Michif, so it's an opportunity. This land has given us an opportunity for our youth to learn their language, to learn their culture.
The Métis Nation also plans to welcome a herd of bison back to this land by the end of the year. Bonnie Allen, CBC News.
Danse, Anin, Boujou, hello and welcome.
It's really fascinating that we can still use our language in this day and age.
Canada, go
I always think about my audience. They always on my mind.
Thank you to Inuit who have always been sharing their stories.
That's the story of our people, never giving up.
We're on our way to Hot Springs Cove in Maquina Marine Provincial Park. It's north of Tofino in the northwestern edge of Clayoquot Sound. We're hoping to learn more about the changes that the Ahousaht First Nation are making within the park alongside BC Parks.
Ahousaht Adventures, Wapuk. I think I'm gonna go inside Vargas, inside Flores, up to the springs.
Thank you, have fun. As you travel north into the heart of Clayoquot Sound, the busy surf shops and restaurant patios of Tofino quickly fade away. Out here, the truly wild West Coast reveals itself. It's the experience that thousands of people from across the globe seek every year when they visit the west coast of Vancouver Island. The sheer number of tourists is part of why the Ahousaht First Nation has taken more control over how many get to visit parks like this one.
This land is ours, and so Hot Springs Cove is a core part of Ahousaht First Nation traditional territory. It's nice to be here with so few guests and to really enjoy the springs. For me, it's been several years since I've been here because it can get too busy.
Tyson Atleo is a leader with the Ahousaht First Nation. He's been working closely with BC Parks to ensure the interests of the nation are being taken into consideration.
So the changes that we have collaborated with BC Parks to implement include restricting the number of commercially permitted operators. So the Ahousaht First Nation commercial operators have exclusive access from sunrise to 11 a.m. every day.
Commercial tour companies can now only bring one boat per day, with a maximum of 12 guests on board. The nation runs day-to-day operations in Hot Springs Cove, though the lands remain in the hands of the provincial government. Like many First Nations across the country, after colonization, the Ahousaht were largely shut out of decisions made about their land, even though they never signed it away in a treaty.
Well, long before visitors came to this region, the hot springs were, of course, a cultural site for my First Nation. And so our people have visited here for time immemorial, for as long as we know, enjoying the springs. And then as time went on, it went relatively unmanaged for a period of time, and many agree that the springs became overcrowded.
You can see how busy it was earlier, and we were like almost waiting to get a spot, so now it's really nice.
And so you'd have days here where you'd have lineups to enjoy the springs, and that's just not really what this place represents.
You took a dip today in the springs.
Yeah.
How was that?
It was magical. It had been some time since I've done it. It was rejuvenating, it was inspiring. We hope that when people come to visit here, they understand that there are precious places like this around the world that really deserve our care and attention and deserve our protection and careful management.
Restricting the number of people at Hot Springs Cove isn't just to create a better recreational experience. This is a wild place, and the crowds were starting to take a toll. These restrictions are new as of this summer, put in place by Ahousaht and BC Parks, and they are still open to change.
How busy was Hot Springs Cove prior to those changes?
It's hard to imagine, but we were seeing upwards of 30 to 32,000 visitors annually. There were days where there were over 300 people arriving at the park, sometimes 75, 80 people waiting to get into the pools at once. And you might have seen the pools, they're quite small. Some people were bathing with soaps, and you have enough of that, and all of a sudden you're starting to see the loss of certain species. And I only have a team, there's myself and 2 other rangers out here, so we are spread thin. Having the Ahousaht Guardian team is really, I can't say enough about how happy I am that there are additional eyes and ears on the water and in the park. And that was one of the big priorities after COVID, was that BC Parks and Ahousaht started to develop a visitor use management strategy. So these are interim permit conditions that will be in effect until February of 2024, at which point we're hoping that the visitor use management strategy will have a little bit more rigor for us to put in place some more maybe permanent permit conditions for these operators. Government takes time sometimes to do things, and this is a huge industry. There's a lot of money involved in hot springs tourism. You have to make the right decisions for everybody.
Tourism is big business in Tofino. Those 30,000 visitors that came to the springs each year represented real money in the hands of local companies. And the commercial access changes at Hot Springs Cove now mean a lot less revenue for those businesses. I reached out to 5 different companies who offered tours to the springs. Most of them didn't want to comment, but one did agree to speak with me about how the changes are impacting them. It's a pretty big reduction, these temporary access limits. So what's different for you?
Our business would have done approximately 1/3 of our business going up to Hot Springs. And today it's dramatically less than that, about half of what we used to be able to generate. So the opportunity for employees who are seasonal has been reduced a bit. And then our potential to generate income has been reduced a little bit as well. I'm really happy and excited and glad to see the Howsett Nation working in the management of the park, being unceded territories. We're dealing with reconciliation, we're dealing with just a new strategy and management. So I imagine they're starting in slowly and then seeing where they can go, rather than just have a free-for-all, which was maybe more how it was business model beforehand.
These children are going to be our future drivers for Ahou's adventures.
In order to take visitors to the springs this summer, the Ahousaht also launched their own tourism company. Woo! It's the first venture of its kind for the nation. They are now taking part in Tofino's booming tourism economy.
In terms of tourism in Tofino, where do you see Indigenous-led tourism? What kind of role do you see?
I think it's really important and really vital. The nations on the coast are a little bit slow to the show to start grasping on to these tourists and trying to share where they are. Like you're in a house at Hahufli right now, So I see this going in a really, really good direction, considering a lot of awareness just all around the world. Like it's not just in Canada, it's not just on Vancouver Island, it's, we're still here even after the attempt of assimilation. So it's important to come into these industries and leave our stamp there.
The Ahousaht aren't the only First Nation at work protecting the lands and waters here in Clayoquot Sound. The Taloquiat First Nation consider all of the land within their traditional territory to fall within 4 tribal parks. That includes Wanajus Hilfuas, as it's known in New Channel, or Mears Island. It was declared a tribal park in 1984 as part of old-growth logging protests known as the War in the Woods. We're headed out with 2 tribal park guardians to find out more about what their work is all about.
The Taloquiat Tribal Park Guardians monitor the parks, doing everything from beach cleanups to river restoration to trail building. They are out on the lands and waters, an active and ongoing presence for the nation.
I've wanted to be a park ranger since I was 12. I've always wanted to protect the land. I've always felt close to nature. And when Guardians became a thing, that was more in line and further with my dream. And the role of a guardian is that of a park ranger and more. Part of asserting that you own the sovereignty of the land, you have to go out on the land. It's the most important thing nations can do, in that we have to show a presence on the territory.
Yeah, that's also why they built the boardwalk, to show we still own this land and still use it. So they built this boardwalk all the ways along.
How important is it to you as a younger Indigenous person to move things forward in that way, in terms of asserting sovereignty and showing that you're here?
It feels great. I feel like I'm really making a difference around here and helping out everybody, trying to help out the nation and everyone else that comes to visit.
declaring a section of land as a tribal park doesn't mean that everything within its boundaries is suddenly protected. The Taloquiat have declared 4 tribal parks in their territory. They overlap with other boundaries, including 3 provincial parks, as well as Pacific Rim National Park Reserve. Some of the land is still open to logging and mining, but the tribal parks help the Taloquiat assert their presence and influence how this land is used now and in the future.
Can you tell us about how the Taloquiat Tribal Parks came to be?
It was born in 1984 from our declaration from our elders for the Mears Island Aboriginal title court case as a way of articulating what Aboriginal title lands are. Taloquiat prepared an Aboriginal title case to stop the logging on Mears Island, and in court it wasn't a question of how to log, when, or where to log. It was who has the right to issue a tree farm permit. And ever since then, we've been negotiating how we can merge or coexist our Aboriginal title with Canadian title. Ultimately, on the 30th anniversary of Mears Island Aboriginal Title Court case on the 2014, we declared our whole territory as a tribal park as a means of sharing and articulating our management of it. We've evolved our tribal parks to articulate our vision for sharing our homeland, our vision for what needs to transform from tree farms to protected areas to protect our culture. It also describes that guardians would monitor the implementation of our tribal park vision.
How different is that vision that Taloquiat have for the land versus the Western vision for the land here?
Good question. So the footprint that's from the provincial government shows that there's tree farms everywhere, which leads to deforestation and broken rivers, impacted fisheries and drinking water. Our vision clearly maps out which rivers need to be restored and salmon recovery programs in place. Our goal isn't sustainability, our goal is abundance.
A new wave of Indigenous-led conservation is on the horizon. First Nations around BC are declaring parts of their territories as something called an IPCA, an Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area. These lands and waters are cared for by a First Nation under their own laws. Each IPCA is unique. Terry Dorward is from Taloquiat. He helped establish their Tribal Park Guardian program. Now he works with other First Nations to create conservation areas of their own.
What is an Indigenous Protected and Conserved Area?
It's a new way of looking at land resource relationships that have become unbalanced because of industrialization. We've had industry come into our territories and completely destroy areas, and who's left standing is the Indigenous people to clean it up. What Indigenous people are coming up with is how do we as Indigenous people not only ensure the well-being of our people, but also the land. As Indigenous people, we've been separated, we've been dislocated, we've been marginalized, we've been dislocated from our own territories. That time is over. The time for reclaiming and revitalizing our roles and responsibilities are now for not only our Indigenous nations, but for solving, this world crisis that we're all part of.
Whether you see it as decolonization or reconciliation, it's a slow process, and it takes hard work. These examples are from the Ahousaht and Taloquiat First Nations on Vancouver Island, but similar efforts are happening all across the country. Here in BC, the government wants 30% of the land protected by 2030, and they are looking to Indigenous protected and conserved areas as part of that. As conversations about land rights and title continue, these parks have a role to play when it comes to reconciliation.
Attend any civic or provincial event in Canada, and you'll hear that it's happening on unceded, ancestral, Indigenous territory. But what does that actually mean when the Crown controls 89% of the land in this country? The Gitxsan territory in northwestern British Columbia that I'm from is unceded. It was never lost in war, it was never surrendered or sold. My uncles fought in courts to have our title to the land upheld in what became known as the Del Gamuch. It's now 25 years old, and hundreds of title cases have followed. And that's why I went back to my territory to find out where things stand now, more than 2 decades later.
gave up our land. We never lost it in war. We never signed it away in treaty. It's still ours.
But Canadian governments have refused to acknowledge that, green-lighting resource project after project for decades.
45 years ago, we declared our relationship to the land and made a declaration about our lands here. 35 years ago, we filed a court action in the Supreme Court of BC. And then 25 years ago, that same court action finally made its way through the Supreme Court of Canada. So 25 years, the impacts of that were great.
All those years ago, the Gitxaans, along with the Wet'suwet'en, took their fight all the way up to the highest court of the land. Hereditary Chief Delgamuukw was the lead plaintiff for the Gitxaan and Gizdewe for the Wet'suwet'en. And they won. The case proved Indigenous people in BC had land rights that had not been extinguished by colonization. And it confirmed oral testimony as legitimate as other forms of evidence. But it was not a declaration of title. Meaning then optimistic leaders are feeling less hopeful today.
What happened to the Delgamuukw case? The Constitution is 40 years old this year. The court case is 25 years old this year. What have you done about it?
Today, the Crown controls 89% of land in Canada. The rest is primarily privately owned. Indian Reserve land, also controlled by the Crown, is 0.2% of Canada's landmass, and legal scholars put land Indigenous people hold through settlement claims at around 7%.
It's shameful that today we haven't moved as we should have in the mid-1990s when the Delgamuukw case was issued by the Supreme Court.
The Delgamuukw case did break ground for others, like the Tsilhqot'in case that led to the first declaration of Aboriginal title in Canada. But it's one of hundreds that aim to confirm title.
The only way we make change, even though it's piecemeal, is having to keep going back to court because Canada doesn't want to enact and implement the decisions that are coming down in the Supreme Court of Canada. If they did, then we wouldn't have to keep going back to court.
Defining what title is really some tragic unfinished business that we have in Canada. But it's time, in my mind, to start taking a risk, moving away from our position of power, putting our swords down and sitting down with communities to hash out what that is.
While Gitxaans have pushed back against the Crown and companies for more than a century, hoping to protect land like this for future generations, the fight against logging and resource extraction isn't over.
This rail line across Gitxaan territory has been blockaded for over 100 years at this point.
The most recent was to support the Wet'suwet'en land defenders after a raid that made national headlines.
This is the spot where the blockade was set up. That occupation lasted for around 2 days, with the RCMP keeping surveillance and amassing over on that bank while the Gitxaan were amassed over on this bank along the highway.
And then there were the police. Not just the beat cops, but those from the Community Industry Response Group, a unit that takes aim at energy industry incidents.
Like, they did not need to use assault rifles here. They did not need to come and terrorize our people in the way that they did. They did not even attempt diplomacy before bringing in those paramilitarized RCMP. And it's pretty clear that that's the status quo in this country. That's how they handle Indigenous descent. That's how they handle the fact that we own the title to these territories, because Canada has no title here.
This is sovereign Wet'suwet'en land. You are trespassing. Get down.
As for police, they say they're just following orders.
I'm proud of what my members in Kirk do each and every day. They have made numerous arrests. To date, we have no one injured to the point where we've had to have anybody, the Independent Investigation Office hasn't looked into any of our activities. We've conducted our duties in a professional manner, enforcing Supreme Court injunctions and enforcing the law to the best of our ability.
As for the provincial government, they wouldn't talk to us for this story.
How do things look 20, 30 years from now? Can I look into my grandchild's eyes and say, we fought it?
I thought that the fight would have been over 25 years ago, and 25 years later, here we are still fighting.
All these years later, the fight remains the same. A cycle of going back to court, blockading roads and railways, and going back to court again. Many of my family members who fought in the Delgamuukw have now passed on. And it leaves me wondering, will my people get their land back in my lifetime?
It's not just water. For the Cree living along the Nelson River, it's the lifeblood of their traditional territory. About 250 kilometers from Thompson, Manitoba, is the Fox Lake Cree Nation. A proud and resilient community who were fishing here long before industry moved in. But this river is also a source of immense power. Dams here send electricity to the south. But to build them, Fox Lake's chief, Maurice Beardy, says the government took the land by the river, which belonged to his people.
Reconciliation is our land, getting our land back. Reconciliation means so much to us. As you know, we've been here since the time immemorial, and we're not going anywhere. We're going to be here for time immemorial for generations to come.
Their struggle is captured here, side by side in these two signs, saying, "Welcome to the same place." Canada owes Fox Lake more than 26,000 acres of land under a treaty signed in 1910. The First Nation says 75 years ago, the government promised them reserved land in and around Gillam. But the land was turned over to Manitoba Hydro instead, and Gillam was flooded with strange men.
Our young women and our men having to basically fight off contractors. They either got beat up, they got raped. And that's when the bad stuff happened in Fox Lake, was probably in the mid-60s when they built Kettle Dam.
Conway Arthurson says his people were called squatters, but they refused to give up their land.
My uncle, my other uncle, my grandmother, my cousin.
Manitoba Hydro and the town of Gillam acknowledged the wrongs they caused and settled with Fox Lake in 2004. This monument lists the names of the community members who didn't see it happen.
I always get emotional when I come to this sign because it shows our people that we're here.
Hydro says it's working with Fox Lake however it can to help them get land. The town has allowed Fox Lake to set up a gaming center there. But Gillam's mayor, Dwayne Foreman, says the thing Fox Lake is most interested in, land, is outside his power.
It's larger than Gillam. It's larger than Fox Lake. This is all of Canada that was affected by this, and this is something that our federal government needs to sit down and discuss at a serious table.
The federal government says it's working to settle with Fox Lake as quickly as possible, but an agreement may take years to negotiate, and then securing the land may take even longer. It may be too late for many of Fox Lake's elders who have already been waiting generations for justice.
You know, time is of the essence because a lot of our elders are dying off that were around back then, and we want some of them to experience, you know, the life that they should have had. Some of these negotiations take, 50, 60 years, and we don't have that kind of time.
As Fox Lake continues to wait, They remain resolute. But they say if Canada is serious about reconciliation, it won't force them to wait another 75 years. Andrew Wiles, CBC News, Gillam.
Different cultures, traditions, and languages, where food unites them all. Celebrating our communities and families through recipes. Time to Eat, stream free on CBC Gem and CBC News Explore.
When I come out this way, it feels like home to me.
Elder Maggie Sakani grew up along this river, knows its every turn. But she is scared her home is at risk.
I don't want to see a road here myself. Not for me, but for my grandkids, my future grandchildren. And they'll probably say, why did Grandma let it happen?
We are near what's known as the Ring of Fire, a massive area in Northern Ontario rich in minerals, and there are plans to build a road through here for mining.
Do you think the government will listen?
I doubt it. I don't think you will.
Maggie and others from Nisga'a First Nation have come here in an act of resistance, planting flags and land declarations saying this land belongs to them. Chief Wayne Munia says they have the right to say what gets developed here.
We need to get the word out. We need to know that there is going to be help for us why we want to do this, why we want to protect our way of life.
The Ring of Fire is about 5,000 square kilometers with rich deposits of nickel, copper, palladium, and chromite, all vital for electric vehicle batteries. Australian mining company Wailu Metals recently acquired the rights to extract most of the minerals and says it's consulting with First Nations like Nisga'a. But here, the promise of jobs and prosperity that the mine could bring is not enough.
The balance should come from the community and the people that are going to be impacted. Nisga'a, for example, has not provided their free prior informed consent to these proposed developments that are taking place, the planning that's taking place.
Clayton Munias points out old campgrounds, places his ancestors are buried along the Attawapiskat River.
This land is very important to me, how I live. Mostly hunting and trapping, also healing.
Despite promises from industry to minimize any impact to this untouched landscape, Clayton is skeptical.
Makes me feel wondering what's going to happen to the land and our hunting territories.
Traditional ways of life could change. Take the sturgeon, once abundant, now a species at risk.
They're going to go check a couple fish nets that they set yesterday. So we got a few already.
They're monitoring the health of the sturgeon here and fear any future disruption in these waters could be a disaster.
This is what we're fighting for here. Life is good here on the river system. So that's what we want to protect.
Today's numbers, thankfully, show promise.
Imagine if development goes in. Where is the sturgeon going to go? See, that's the thing. And that's what I asked the public to understand and acknowledge the fact that we are people too, and we will defend our rights.
Back at camp, a cookout, drying today's catch. A tag is found in one of the fish.
It's an Ontario Ministry MNR. It says 06390. It's a tag. As you can see, look. This is what was found in one of the sturgeons we're about to eat.
A subtle reminder of constant government presence, a program they say they knew nothing about.
If we're going to have willing partnerships, if we're going to talk about relationship building, we should be able to at least be part of these types of programs, especially when they're on our traditional homelands,
our river system.
Tied to these lands and waters, Neskantaga promises to fight for its future, for a good life, for as long as the rivers flow. Logan Turner, CBC News, Neskantaga First Nation.
Nain, the northernmost community in Newfoundland and Labrador, and the largest Inuit settlement along the province's north coast. It's the dead of winter. For Inuit, that means sea ice, and sea ice means freedom. It used to be that every November, the ocean would turn from blue to white. Each day, the layer of ice thickens. By December, the ice is a flat highway. Locals can venture further afield, able to hunt and fish, find wood to stay warm. But these days, the wait for the ice stretches on. This year, it's January before the ocean freezes enough to even walk on.
You look scared.
I am.
Yeah.
I am very scared. The regular for us is we spend about 8 to 9 months in cold weather and then about 3 to 4 months in the summer. And so like a lot of our culture and our livelihood is tied to these cold temperatures, and also a lot of our biodiversity, our wildlife, the things that we depend on for sustenance and for food, they also depend on cold weathers. And you know, this warmer weather is coming. There's a lot of uncertainty on what that means for our communities and for our culture, so it is very scary.
There's no stopping what's happening here. All the latest gadgets, data, and drone footage can't return the North Coast to the temperatures it once experienced. Climate change is hitting Labrador hard. It's getting warmer. By some accounts, average temperatures will rise by up to 12 degrees by the end of this century. And there's nothing anyone can do to reverse it.
That's also like one of my fears as well, because I am a mom and I do want my daughter to have those aspects of my culture grown into her life, and so it's like the uncertainty is real and it's terrifying.
As the environment here changes, it's forcing the people to change along with it. Rex Hallwell Jr. heads an Inuit-owned company that uses digital technology to tell people whether the ice is thick enough to travel on. In this new world of unpredictable weather, this app is now essential for keeping them safe.
Smart Ice was founded because what happened was that we had, in 2009 and 2010, we had rain in January here in Nain. Today it's what, minus 41 with wind chill? And that's what it's supposed to be, but back then, you know, we had rain, so it was in the plus. So we were seeing the effects of climate change. So what happened was people were concerned about the climate that was changing, and it was impacting our traditional way of life. So we weren't able to, you know, travel safely on ice because, you know, people were falling through the ice, and you know, they were unsure of their travel routes.
It's called Smart Ice, and it's helping 24 northern communities across Canada, that number growing. They deploy buoys, long tubes that measure water and ice temperatures to tell how thick the ice is, and then relay that data to an app that residents can check before they travel. The company has also created a smart homotic, or sled, that operators can tow behind a snowmobile, checking ice thickness in remote areas in real time.
Not traveling on the sea ice, that's one of the biggest things of our culture. You know, people say it's a part of our culture. It's not a part of our culture. It is our culture to travel on the sea ice. So, you know, in 20, 30 years, when people can't travel on the sea ice, that's going to be the loss of our culture. You know, and when people think of Inuit, they think of people traveling on the sea ice. So that whole loss of the sea ice and the ability of traveling on it, that's going to be a loss of our culture.
But the struggle to hang on to traditions that date back hundreds, if not thousands of years in an isolated subpolar community comes with hurdles. Here, a cable broke as Hallwell was trying to train a new group of operators. He might not get another one in the mail for weeks.
It is haunting me, but I mean, really, the only thing that we can do now is try to come up with more tools like we have with Smart Ice to monitor the sea ice, to ensure when people are traveling on the sea ice that they're safe and they can do it for longer periods of time to keep their culture alive. And really, that's the only thing. Like we've always, we've always adapted to living in the North. It's just now we have to face a new way of adapting to living in the North, where it's going to be loss of our culture, it's going to be loss of the sea ice.
Without creative solutions like Smart Ice, Inuit here would face the dissolution of an ancient culture. Derek Pottle lives in Rigolet. Hunting, fishing, trapping is his identity.
The land and the sea is who I am. It's what keeps me alive. It's my heartbeat. It keeps me healthy. It keeps me grounded.
South of Nain, thin ice. Trapping residents in their communities. They can't hunt or get wood to heat their homes.
If it keeps going the way that it's going now, we may not even have a winter like what we're so used to having, and that's, if we see the continuation of what we've been seeing in the last 15 years or so, for the next 15 years, we could see some major, major changes. And if you listen to everything that's being put out there by the so-called experts, if we all stop, the whole world today stop using fossil fuel, we're not stopping this trend. My generation could be the last generation that knows this lifestyle, and that's scary when you take, a culture's identity away from.
But the land is changing. For the people on the coast, the change they're forced to live with isn't fair.
The Inuit population, we're a very small population, and we're probably some of the people who don't contribute a whole lot to climate change, but we're going to be some of the first people who are going to be very, very, very affected by climate change with the loss of our sea ice and the loss of our culture.
For many here in Nain, it's all about adaptation. But while they know big changes are coming, it's impossible to predict how it'll all play out and affect the future of the Inuit way of life. Malone Mullen, CBC News, Nain, Labrador.